she's written for the Washington Post, her hometown area, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, Family Circle, Times Spectator, Food 52, Food Network, The Sweet Genius Show. And she's also appeared on over 30 TV shows as well. She really gets there. Fox News, New York. She's done locally, The Home and Family here, NBC Washington, San Diego Living. Again, she is the Kosher Baker. That's her website. Her Instagram is @kosherbaker. And also she is a mother of 4. And actually, conveniently, her son just started back up locally here, not too far from here at USC. So she was able to help get him settled in. But today we are celebrating her book here. And I'm just going to have Paula take it away from there. Paula.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great intro. So I'm very happy to be here, and it's great to meet all of you. And I've been so impressed with the staff and their preparation of recipes from my book. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my background and a bit about how this book came to be. And then I'm going to teach you some tips through 2 of the recipes from the book. So my interest in cooking really started in my grandmother's kitchen in Brooklyn. And I can still picture myself there because the kitchen had marigold yellow and fuchsia pink cabinets, like classic 1970s. And I would sit like at a counter like this, and I would watch my grandmother make like the tiniest meatballs and make cakes that were this tall. And she would roll her rugelach in so much sugar that anybody who took a bite would choke. And I would watch her, measuring with her hands. But, all through my childhood and as I got older, I never even imagined that this would be a career choice for me. I went to college to become a doctor and ended up in law school and practiced law for 4 years, and then became a speechwriter for 2 years, and really went to cooking school in France just for fun, but ended up with a catering business in Geneva, Switzerland, and then came back to the States, edited cookbooks for other authors, and taught cooking classes in my home. I had 2 kids in Geneva, came back to Washington, had twins. So I had 4 kids under the age of 5. So teaching cooking classes was a great flexible job. And still today, I still marvel kind of where I started and how I ended up here. And I'm still not really done reinventing myself in the food world. We'll see what I come up with next. So about 35 years after spending my time in my grandmother's kitchen, I was contacted. I was already doing lots of cooking demos for synagogues and Jewish community centers and different groups all over the US. And my name gets, recommended and passed around different communities. So I got a call from a synagogue in Brooklyn asking me if I would do a cooking demonstration in their rabbi's house. So I saw where it was from, and I called this woman up on the phone, and I say to her, if I do this cooking class, would I be doing it at 3844 Lime Avenue in Brooklyn? It's in a place called Seagate at the end of Coney Island. So the woman says to me, how do you know the address of our rabbi's house? And I tell her that was my grandparents' house. So I do a cooking class in that same kitchen where I watched my grandmother cook. She was the great baking influence in my life because my mother didn't bake. And I stood in that same kitchen, which had been tastefully redecorated. And my mother, my daughter, my aunt were all there. And when I got up to speak, I thought I would be, verklempt and overwhelmed with emotion. Grandma had lived to the age 98 on a steady diet of sponge cake and Sanka. And when I stood up there holding the Kosher Baker cookbook in my hands, which took 5 years to get out into the world, I had this amazing feeling like this is what I was meant to be doing. And of course, Grandma would never have imagined that I would write 4 cookbooks, go on TV over 38 times, travel the world to try to inspire people in the same way that she inspired me. So I get a call from my editor, I guess about 2 years now, to write a Jewish cookbook with a healthy approach. Now, which made perfect sense to me because when you're a pastry chef, you kind of can't live on babka. You have to eat regular food sometimes. So I always loved to cook. I just hadn't done any. I had just gotten to started cooking healthier over the years to balance out all the desserts I was preparing. But this call from my editor came a mere 5 weeks after my mother passed away from a very short battle with lung cancer. So at the time when I got this call to write this cookbook, I was spending most of my evenings at home on the sofa every night with my two new best friends, Ben and Jerry. And I would eat my feelings, kind of trying to feel better. I'm sure there are other people here who know what I'm talking about. Now, I knew I couldn't stay on that sofa forever. And I knew I needed to get up and do something. So I decided to write this book because I love writing cookbooks. And I realized that at some point during a dark time in your life, or just on a Tuesday where everything's going wrong, you kind of need to take a step forward to the light, to something new. So I agreed to write this cookbook. And the first recipe I tackled was my grandmother's legendary stuffed cabbage. So I swapped out the beef with ground turkey, and I didn't put so much sugar in the recipe. And I streamlined grandma's recipe, which when she taught me used every burner in my kitchen, down to like 2 pots and 2 burners. And of course I worried, like, would it taste like grandma's recipe? But it really did. And then I started taking more recipes that I grew up with and started changing them around and playing around with ingredients. And I just abandoned ingredients I used for years. The ketchup, the brown sugar in the meat dishes, the puff pastry, mayonnaise, all of that gone, and just use natural ingredients. And the mango coleslaw is just a great example of that, which I'm going to show you in 1 second. And so I started writing this book, and the sad thing is that my father also passed away as this book went to press. And so I dedicated the book to them, and it's basically recipes that I grew up with that I reinvented. So on the cover, you see like there are these grilled carrots with a pea puree. I grew up with peas and carrots from a can. And I'm not sure if California people know what that is, but back in the 70s, it was a big thing. Like, that's what we had, was canned vegetables. So I'm going to show you how to make the mango coleslaw and tell you like how this came to be. Now, on the East Coast, and this may be true here as well, there isn't a barbecue, a bris, a baby naming, a synagogue event where there's not coleslaw drowning in mayonnaise. When we were sitting Shiva for my mother, I think we got a vat every day of mayonnaise drowning. I mean, mayonnaise just doused coleslaw. And I'm a master at repurposing food. And I can teach anybody how to take like Shiva food or morning food or food that just shows up at your house and repurpose it into something else. It's like, I call it Shiva chopped, but that's for another time. But you can't repurpose coleslaw. There's nothing to do with it. Now, I started putting mango in my coleslaws for my kids when I made them fish tacos, but then I came up with this idea of using the mango in the dressing. So the first part of the recipe is that you're going to cut up cabbage. Now the recipe is Napa cabbage, green cabbage, and red cabbage. Quick thing about Napa cabbage, I use Napa cabbage now for my grandmother's stuffed cabbage because the leaves are easier to roll than the green cabbage. So one tip there. Now look how masterfully this has been chopped, okay? Thank you, Ashley, for this. I teach cooking classes to campers at Camp Vermont, Massachusetts, and I've done it for 13 years. And I try to explain to kids to cut food in pieces that you actually want to eat. So I know what this coleslaw tastes like when the cabbage pieces are gigantic, because that's what my campers did this summer. I tried my best. Now, if you only have one kind of cabbage, you could do that too. And obviously, you can use this dressing for pretty much anything. So you're just going to like mix up all your 3 different cabbages in a bowl. And then you're going to slice up some green onions, and you're going to dump those in as well. Usually I do this with my hands. I think your hands are your 2 best kitchen tools. And we're just going to mix this up. And this is basically the whole coleslaw. But you could always mix in arugula into this. You could really make the salad anything you like. So we're going to mix that up. And now we're going to do the dressing. So we're going to start with mango. The mango has to be really ripe. Because if the mango is not ripe, then the lime juice in the recipe overpowers it, and it just tastes like lime. So I'm going to put all my mango in here. And I've got cilantro. Now, I've done a couple of events around the country where people hate cilantro. So what I do instead is I combine Italian parsley and basil. You know what I'm talking about. So I combine half Italian parsley, half basil instead, and the recipe is still terrific. Chopped red onions. And now I'm going to put in some oil. And I usually use a light oil for this. I'll use avocado. I'll use safflower. And here is a little bit of vinegar to give it a little more sharpness. This is my lime juice. And here I have honey. Now, the recipe has, I believe, a teaspoon of honey in it. And this is my trick because I often have those honey bears at home. You know what I'm talking about? Where you could like squeeze out the honey. Measuring honey is a pain. So what I always teach people is if you're holding the bear or the bottle that you can squeeze over it, a short squeeze is a teaspoon. and a little bit longer squeeze is a tablespoon. Like count to 3, and that's a tablespoon. And that way you don't have to have this stuck in here. Here, I'm just going to use my finger, but we all know how messy it is to measure honey. So I don't want to measure honey, so instead I'll do it that way. All right, I'm going to put on my gloves to add the jalapeno to it. Now the recipe has a half a jalapeno, and you can omit it if you don't want any spice. It doesn't really taste spicy. Did it taste spicy in what you tasted? Sometimes it has a little kick. So, we're dealing with nature, and some jalapenos are bigger than others, and some are spicier than others. You can always add some of the seeds. But this is how I get the seeds out. At this tip on TV, I go on the ABC affiliate in DC on a regular basis. Half a teaspoon measuring spoon. Always want to use the gloves. And then I take the spoon and I kind of rub it down here, and it takes out the vein and all the seeds. So it's super easy to do. And you can always put them on here. I'm going to roughly chop it because I'm going to put this in. And once again, if you wanted it spicier, you can always make it spicy. I'm a little bit spice averse, which I'm afraid to even say out loud in California, but in a land of really good spicy food. But you can adjust things, and I always feel like as a recipe writer, it's kind of fair to give people ranges. Did I get this on before? Hold on. There we go. So I'm just going to mix this all up. And then, oops, hold on. Ooh, has an instant pulsing thing. I'm just going to scrape it down a little bit. I would normally use a silicone spatula. So it's basically going to end up being a yellow dressing with green specks in it. And it's really good with like poached salmon too. There we go. Got all these fun buttons. Okay, we're good. So here's what the dressing looks like. You see that? It's just a green, luscious, thick dressing. And look at the consistency. Like, doesn't have any mayonnaise or anything like that. And you're just going to pour this over your dressing. Now, people always ask me about buying the pre-shredded coleslaw for this. But sometimes the pre-shredded the cabbage is really, really in tiny, tiny pieces. So I kind of like having a little texture. And then you're just going to mix this up. At home, we serve this in fish tacos. In the fish tacos in the book, the fish is baked in the oven as opposed to fried in the pan. I also have an oven frying method for latkes and schnitzel in here, where you heat up sheet pans of oil, and then you put your food on it, and then you bake it, and then turn it over. And it's really, really crispy. And you use so much less oil than you would if you were frying it. And anybody who's made latkes before knows what a mess that makes as well. So baking them in the oven is so much better. So here you go. Here's this dressing, and it's really, really simple. I just love this recipe because it's so healthy, and it's been shocking to me how many kids really like this. Whenever you put dressing on a salad, even when the recipe has a certain amount, I still always put a little bit at a time. Helps you mix it in better and make sure that you don't end up with dressing that is just, too drowning in dressing. See, this is so perfect. Look at the size of the pieces. So there you go. I once did this someplace where they chopped up the mango and jalapeno and just threw it in with the cabbage. Don't do that. Okay. So there you go. I'm going to put this over here, and I'm going to move on to our sweets. Do I have a cover for this? I guess they're getting me the cover. Okay, cool. All right. Let me get this ready for our dessert. So as you can see, I like to use tools if I can. I do a lot of things by hand. I just need this cleaned, and then I'm ready to go. Okay, I'm going to move on to the sweet stuff. So I had a lot of fun taking like my mother's chicken soup and turning it into Vietnamese noodle soup, and I love writing desserts as the kosher baker. It's really my favorite thing about developing recipes. But for this book, I took recipes that I love, that I make all the time, and I added whole grain flours to them. So I have chocolate babkin here that has coconut oil rather than margarine, and some spelt flour in the dough. I have an Israeli rugelach that's whole grain. There's a gluten-free challah in here. There is also a sourdough challah. So, and yes, the sourdough challah takes 2 weeks and 3 days to make, but it's really good for you, and it's really good. So if you have sourdough starter around, it's kind of a fun thing to try to do. So it's really great. And And I really loved playing around with the desserts here so that I could really make them to see. It was like almost like a game for me, like, okay, how healthy can I go? And I'm a really big fan of trying to make sure that there isn't too much sugar in my recipes. And I haven't tasted the tart yet, but there isn't a lot of sugar. This one, because I use the dark cocoa, I have some sugar in the dough. But often when I make a galette tart, I don't even put any sugar in the dough because the filling has enough sweetness for it. Desserts should taste like what they are and not just taste like sugar. So much of the packaged cookie and even the bakery industry is all predicated on everything having so much sugar that you don't taste a flavor. You don't taste the lemon or the cinnamon or the chocolate. You just taste something sweet. So I'm really big on making sure that the desserts have an actual flavor, because otherwise they all start to taste the same. If you think about packaged cookie, they just all taste the same. So I always make cookie dough or pie dough in the food processor. You can do it by hand, but the goal of making pie crust and cookie doughs that you want to be flaky is that you don't want to break down all of the fat as you're making it. So by using the full food processor, you can pulse it and just stop pulsing it before the dough completely smushes into each other. So this recipe, I use coconut oil. Now, not everybody in this world likes the taste of coconut oil. So if you're ever substituting coconut oil in a recipe, add in a little bit more of whatever flavor that dessert is. So if I'm making something cinnamon, I'll add more cinnamon. Lemon, more lemon zest. So here I have a lot of cocoa here that helps balance out the coconut taste. So we're going to start with the dry ingredients. We're going to do our flour and our sugar and our salt. Now, for this recipe, I use Hershey's dark cocoa typically. It's the one with the red label on it. It's like really, really dark cocoa, and it is more bitter than the regular unsweetened cocoa. So if you have a chocolate cake you've made forever and you want to switch the dark cocoa to get that really black color in your cake, add a tablespoon of sugar to your recipe to balance out that bitterness in this cocoa. And this I'm just going to pulse just to mix this a little bit. Nope. All right. So lock this in first. Hold on. Is that the right side? All right. I'm sure I'm going to get this right at some point. I may need help. There we go. So we're just going to pulse it. Mix it for about 10 seconds just to distribute the flour with the cocoa a bit. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is add our coconut oil. So this is what I did with the coconut oil. I measure it from the little canister it comes in, and I put my tablespoons on a plate. And I just stick them in the fridge or the freezer, depending how soon you're going to make it, so that it gets hard. The flakiness in pie and cookies comes from the fact that there'll be pieces of fat in your dough that aren't completely smushed. They will keep their shape, like little pebbles, basically. These pebbles melt in the oven and press up against the dry ingredients and create those pockets, which gives you the flakiness. So you don't want to over mix pie dough or cookie dough so that you're completely smushing whatever fat you're using. And you could make this recipe with butter if you wanted to as well. So here's my coconut, and I'm just going to pulse this for about maybe 10 seconds because it doesn't have to be, fully mixed in at all. And then when you do this, see if I can show you one, you have even like little pieces of, you see that? Like little pieces of fat. It's going to get mixed up a little more with the other ingredients, but then they'll be a little bit smaller, but they will still be there. Okay, you don't want them to disappear altogether. So now we're going to add, our egg. And I always start with like 1 teaspoon of water. Usually I put like an ice cube in the water, but we'll be fine here. It's cold. And then I'm going to pulse this for maybe just 5 times. When pie dough is done, it shouldn't really all come together. I keep making the same mistake. There we go. All right. And then I'm going to put my next tablespoon in. So I'm mixing this in a little bit at a time. And here's our last one. Sometimes I describe how dough should look like. It should look like clumps of couscous. This is still a little powdery, so I'm going to mix this up a little bit more. And then I'll mix it. So it doesn't have to fully come together. I'm going to show you what these clumps look like. So if I look at it here, and also the other way to test for a dough, you could take the pieces and put this in your hand. You see how easily it comes together? And then you know you're good here. So you see it's like, here, I'll hold this up. It's mostly crumbs, but there's a little pieces where part of the crumbs have come together. And we're just going to finish this in the, I have parchment. Where's the other, can I have a piece of parchment or plastic wrap? Thank you. And then I'm going to dump this out on plastic wrap and use the paper or parchment or the plastic to like fold it up, because I really am trying to avoid using my hands because your hands are warm. Thank you. Let's see if I can pull it up. There we go. Ooh. There we go. Very nice. All right, so let's take out our blade here. And you see it's mostly crumbs, but you're going to see what happens in a second. Kind of use the folding it together to kind of finish mixing it up. So I'm going to use my plastic and I'm going to press it together. So I don't handle it any more than I absolutely have to. Now, I'm really partial to chocolate desserts always, because my mother used to hide chocolate fudge cakes from Entenmann's in her closet in her bedroom. So every chocolate dessert is like a tribute to my mother, who believed that if it wasn't chocolate, there was no point to the dessert at all. Only dessert is worth the calories. So like, see, it's like folded into a bit of a square. And now I'm just going to cover this up like this, loosely at first. And I'm going to flatten it so that it's going to be easier to roll out later. And you just put this in your freezer for about 20 minutes. Now you could do this days in advance and then just take it out and you roll it out when you're like just ready to thaw it. All right, let's get our filling ready. We're going to get ready to roll out the dough. I was very excited to see one of these rolling pins. These French rolling pins are great. I told my children, if anybody ever breaks into the house and you need a weapon, go into the kitchen and get these rolling pins because they're really hard. Oh, I think we're almost there here. I'm going to need a brush, please. So what's nice about this recipe is that you can use like whatever fruit that you like. So I'm going to use, and I always roll out pie doughs between 2 pieces of parchment. I'm going to show you that, but I want to get our filling made first. So here we have these gorgeous, gorgeous Melissa's Produce peaches. Check these out. They're just beautiful. So we're going to put our peaches in here. And beautiful raspberries. I love being on the West Coast. All the produce is so great. And you could do all of one fruit. You could do whatever you like. One of the things that I started doing recently is I have a beach house for the month of August in New York, and I have, I don't know, like 12 people every weekend. And growing up with 3 sons, an 8-inch pie pretty much feeds 2 of them. So I started making slab pies, like literally this big. So you could, I've done this recipe, you triple the recipe, you put like 2/3 of the recipe on the bottom and do the other third to make a design on top. For my twins' high school graduation party, I did this dough and I made the entire filling with raspberries. So you had chocolate dough with the bright pink, and I cut out hearts with cookie cutters from the dough and put a bunch of hearts on top of the dough. It was great. But if you go on my website, thekosherbaker.com, there's a pop-up to get my blueberry slab pie recipe, and you can make a slab pie anywhere you like. All right, so now I'm just going to mix together sugar and cornstarch. You can always use some flour. And one of the tips I always give for when you're making fruit pies is like taste the fruit. Taste the bite. Are your blueberries really tart? Or are they really sweet? Blackberries? What a range in flavor in blackberries. It could be extremely tart or extremely sweet. And then you can adjust the sugar. But I'm not really a big fan of having too much of it. So I'm going to have to use my hands for this, but that's fine. Here, I'll put the gloves on, and I will do it that way, just because it's so much easier. The first weekend I was at the beach, I made blueberry and plum, and last week I did peach and blueberry. So you're just going to kind of mix this all up together, and you want to mix it up until you don't see any more of the cornstarch and sugar, so it doesn't look white. Blueberries don't absorb it, so if you're doing all blueberries, you're going to have to mix them for a while to get like the sugar and stuff to melt. All right, you guys get the idea here, right? Okay, we have our beautiful filling. It's kind of ready to go. All right, I'm going to put these aside, and I'm going to roll out the dough. And you know, doughs for tarts and pies are really good to just have in your freezer and like ready to go. I mean, Thanksgiving, I've got, by Monday night, every pie crust is in the freezer. You just have to, spread things out. When I was in cooking school in France, we did everything in stages. French pastry looks like somebody was in the kitchen for hours, right? But they weren't. Classic French dessert, pear tart. The dough I would make on a Monday, stick it in the freezer. Tuesday, I'd poach the pears. Wednesday, I'd make the almond cream. And then on Thursday morning, I would put it all together. Each step took me 5 to 8 minutes and just looked like this, absolutely fabulous thing. All right, so I'm going to start rolling this out. We had very strict instructions in cooking school in Paris of how to sprinkle the flour when you were rolling things out. So if anybody speaks French, it's comme il pleut, like it's raining. So that if you sprinkle down here, you end up with bigger clumps of it. We want to do a little bit at a time. So we're going to do that. And we're going to unwrap our dough, which is now perfect. We timed it right. And it's hard for you guys to see it from there, but if you look at this dough, you see little specks of coconut in it, which is fine. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit more on top. And then I'm going to put my other one on top here. And I'm going to roll this out. And what's so great about rolling on parchment is that you can turn it so easily in every direction. So a couple of things. When you're rolling it out, if it ever gets really soft, I mean, we get a lot more humidity than you guys do, but if it's ever really hot in your kitchen and everything is sticking too much, you take the whole package and stick in the freezer for 5 minutes, and then you can go back to rolling it again. And then what I'll do is every once in a while, I'm going to lift it up, and I'm going to sprinkle it a little bit more. Whenever you're rolling out for this, do not roll over the edge, like roll just to the edge, because you don't want the edges to be so thin, right? So just roll to the end, and I keep turning in every direction. And really, there is no special way to do this. You kind of want it more or less in a circle, but if it ends up looking like Australia, that's okay too. I once had a student in a cooking class who really, when I say roll something in a rectangle, it was really in a rectangle. And the other thing I like to do every once in a while is flip the entire package over and just give it a little bit more flour there. Just a little bit. You see how little I sprinkle at a time? My kids used to make challah in kindergarten, and they would come home with these horrible challahs that people just, not just kids, but adults love sprinkling flour on things. All right, so now I'm going to share with you my most important baking tip, which is about baking time. So I've done cooking classes all over the world. I've been in so many different kinds of ovens and kitchens, commercial, people's homes, whatever, and things don't always bake exactly the same. They just don't. So I tell people the first time they make a recipe, a dessert recipe, my recipe, anyone's recipe, is subtract time. So if the cake says bake it for an hour, bake it for 50 minutes. Cake says for 40, bake it for 30. Cookies for 12 minutes, bake them for 10. And then you check them. You can always add time, but you cannot take it away. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to give it one more roll here, and then I'll fill it. And you can check cookies by pressing on them. People overbake desserts all the time. I had a scone the other day from a coffee shop, and I took one bite, and it was like 6 minutes too long. Like I literally took a bite and said, oh, why? They just killed it. It was a pecan and chocolate one. It was lovely. All right, so this is a very sophisticated French cooking technique. Okay, right? Watch carefully. We dump the fruit. And we catch any blueberries that fly away. And sometimes if I'm baking this for a lot of people, and I kind of distribute the fruit, if all the berries are in one place, I'll move some of the red ones over here. I just kind of spread it out in the middle and make sure the blueberries don't run all the way away. So there you go. And I didn't do this perfectly because I want to show you like it doesn't matter. So then you kind of take this and you start folding up the dough around it like this. And you just kind of want to make sure that wherever you're folding, you end up having some fruit in there. Let's spread this out a little bit more in these little corners. There we go. So you're just kind of pleating it like this. And you see there's a little bit of flour there, but we can brush that off, and we're going to brush the top with some egg white. You'll see at the end, we're going to shape it up a little bit more. Okay. And these are just always they're just so pretty. And you can make the recipe all with, okay? So here, I got a little hole here. We're going to fix that. So there we go. We have our fruit in there. So now I'm going to take my egg white, and I'm just going to brush the top of it. And then I'll use that to try to get off some of this flour. Whoops, and not do that. There we go. Yeah, I've done enough TV to know that something's always going to go wrong, and you just have to be like, all right, how are we rolling with it? I started dusting my silicone pans when I make chocolate cake with cocoa instead of flour, so that way I don't have to deal with any white stuff on top. Let's try to get that done. All right, so there we go. Let me fold this up a little more. I'm going to clean up my egg, and there we go. And this is great because then you can slide it right on your baking sheet, and then you bake it in the oven, and you want to bake it until it bubbles a little bit. Let me move this over here. So yeah, with baking time, just do not overbake things. So this cookbook of mine, I always say to people, it's like a way to start eating better. I'm not one of those chefs that are to come out there and preach to you and say, you should only be eating the following. I travel to Israel every year. I travel to France. I eat my way through bakeries. I chronicle my travels on Facebook and Instagram, and I have a great time. But I also am a bit of an athlete. I run, I walk, I move around all the time to kind of balance that out. And so I don't preach to anyone and say, how they're going to eat. But what I'm trying to do, and my goal of this book was to try to get my community and other people to just take a shift towards healthier eating. Because I don't think you can tell people you can't have this ever. People are not ready for that. So if you give people the tools to kind of think about planning their meals a little bit differently, they can start moving towards more healthful eating. And I always say that life is unpredictable. Like, I can't tell you, and nobody can tell you, that eating healthy food will help you live longer. But I do know that when I eat healthier food, I actually feel better now. Like today, I want to have energy for my husband, for my children, for all my work and all the things I want to do in my life. So by eating more natural food like these recipes, I just automatically feel lighter myself. So, for me, I love all my books, but this one will always be special to me because of the genesis of how it came to be. And, I feel like revolutions start really slowly, and I'm still trying to get people in the really religious Jewish communities to just eat a little bit better. People are so attached to their comfort foods, and I get it. We all love comfort food, especially these days with the news and the politics. People are stressed, and people will eat to make themselves feel better. But what if you could take the food of your grandparents and start taking out some of that extra sugar and that extra white flour and stop using salami as an ingredient, which many people still do, then you can save those recipes for another generation. Because younger chefs in their 30s and 40s, some of them are really strict about what they give their children. It's really quite shocking. And, my kids always had desserts around because I was a pastry chef, but I always had so much healthy food around too. So some of those women are going to say, well, I'm never going to make a tzimmus or a kugel, or, we only have whole wheat challah and we only have this. And I'm like, okay, but let's try to make sure that you don't wholesale, ignore this wonderful food tradition of our history. So by helping people find recipes that they recognize, that they love, they don't have to give them up. They can just I'm trying to give them the tools to kind of healthy them up in even small ways. I came up with a couple of keto recipes for Passover this year, including keto matzo balls, which had ground chicken in them. So it's no matzo meal. It's just basically a chicken meatball. I keep trying to put more of these recipes out there and kind of see what will stick. And it's just been a lot of fun for me to do that. And I feel very privileged to have a chance to do that and have an opportunity to speak to so many people. When I come to the West Coast, it's an easier sell to say to people, I want you to stop buying food from that part of the supermarket. Like, just go to the produce and go there, than it is on the East Coast and people who really don't like change. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to spread the word about this book so that I can get more and more people to eat like I do, to feel better, and to just kind of teach their children that, yes, our traditions, recipes are delicious and they can be healthy, and they're not just like super, super heavy food. So I appreciate everybody coming, and I'm happy to take any questions about these recipes or anything else about the book.